Alrighty, so our next speaker is Adam Light, and Adam's going to be talking on the scientific method in building a culture of quality. So welcome, Adam Light. Thanks very much, Adam.
I want to start today with a simple question. If you're trying to change culture, is it better to focus on trying to change what people think or how they act? Well, organizational psychologists have been studying this for about 60 years, so the evidence is in. It's far easier to act your way into a new way of thinking than it is to think your way into a new way of acting. So the route to culture change lies through behavior. Now, since there's so many different people who have studied this, you can almost choose your source based on your favorite color. You can certainly choose based on your favorite reading style. So what all these authors agree on about culture change? Well, they say that people who are good influencers of culture are able to paint a very clear picture of the outcomes they want to achieve, where they want to go, and how they're going to measure it. Then they're able to, and they spend a lot of time doing this, finding the behaviors that are going to lead toward that change that they want to make. And there's some trial and error with that. Once they find those behaviors, then they find ways to amplify those effective change behaviors. So what I want to tell you today is why your abilities as a quality assurance professional make you ideally suited to this work of influencing culture change, and how you can use those abilities to create a culture of quality. Now, testers are like scientists in a lot of ways. They're curious. They're always asking, how does this work? How does the system work? Why does the customer do things that way? And what if the inputs were different? They are open-minded, so they're not in love with the business plan or in love with the design. In fact, they're always looking for ways to find inconvenient counterexamples that sort of shed light on those things, because they know that if you find a counterexample, it causes people to reinvestigate the theory and improve things. So if you can find a counterexample, you improve the design, and you boost the chances of overall success in the long run. And testers are skeptical. If you bring a tester or something that says this is a solved problem, they're usually going to say, well, maybe that's just a facet of the problem. Wouldn't it be interesting to see if that reveals some new aspect of the problem that we can shed light on? But maybe most important is that testers are diligent. And this is important because once you've set that clear picture of the future you want to reach, those outcomes and how you're going to measure them, then the best way to get there is through a series of experiments. So you're not always going to get outcomes from every repetition, but sometimes you get outcomes, but every time you get learning. And so in some senses, changing culture is about repetition, but it's not about repeating yourself or saying the same thing or beating the same drum. It's about trying something, seeing what works, responding to that, and trying again. So if we want to change and create a culture of quality, then we need to define what that culture of quality is. I think most people would agree that culture of quality has a component of a rigorous process, and that it's focused on customer satisfaction. So we want to inspect or at least sample everything that's going to the customer, so there won't be problems delivered to the customer. If we find a problem, we want to go back and look at the process and find out what it was that caused that problem so we can improve the process. And then there's kind of this meta aspect where we're applying that quality process to the quality process itself. And that's really what defines a culture of quality. So we can think of that as our North Star, this thing that gives us direction. We're trying to reach the North Star. But when you're trying to make culture change, you not only need a true sense of direction, you also need a sense of progress. And the North Star is good for direction because it's always in the same place, but we never seem to get any closer to it, right? So it's important then or valuable to set a challenge, which is something that's closer, and so you can tell whether you're getting closer to it, but it's also in line with the North Star. So I'm going to I'm going to illustrate this by an example. A company that I was working with, they had a process. They were scaling up. They were developing all their applications in several areas, adding to them, trying to scale up their business. And they needed to see how those applications would work together in an integrated environment. So they had an integration test environment. They were trying to work rapidly, so they had 3-week release cycles. And in a sense, they had kind of a release train. So every 3 weeks, they were supposed to integrate everything and release it. But what was happening is that between the last stop and the final destination, things were either falling off the train or having to get pulled off the train. So they weren't really meeting their 3-week cycle. So the challenge they set for themselves, this was causing a lot of problems, by the way, for their customers, because the customers needed to, that close to a major release, they needed to have predictability. So it was creating the opposite of customer satisfaction. So they created themselves, they set this challenge, which is to have predictable integrated releases every 3 weeks, every time. So when you're trying to improve process and create a culture of quality, it's valuable to not think in terms of problems and solving problems, but rather to ask the question, how can we improve our process? And the reason for this is that from wherever you are to that goal, that challenge is going to have multiple aspects to it, and there's going to be more than one solution path. So you're going to get there faster if you're evaluating a viable solution path than if you're arguing about which is the biggest part of the problem and what the best optimal solution to it is. So they looked at their current place and sort of comparing where they are now to where they want to be, and they found a couple of things. They found that they had an unreliable process. The integration testing process itself was unreliable, and the inputs were highly variable to that process. So then they looked at the problem and they said, well, what's a goal that's a short-term goal that we can aim for? What's an aspect of this problem we can really focus on? And for this part, it's useful to use what we call X to Y language. So what they found was their installations into that test environment could take up to a week. So out of the 3-week cycle they had to do the integration testing, it was taking them up to a week just to actually get things into a place where they could test them. So that's the first thing they wanted to tackle. They wanted to go from X to Y, from an average of 4 days to 1 day every time, right? And that was a short-term goal that they could then focus on, and then they broke it down further. So they looked at the obstacles. What are the obstacles to reaching that short-term goal? And they found that one of the obstacles was the environment. So there's an infrastructure group that controlled the integration test environment, all the environments. And they were finding, they had the same pressures as everybody else to grow and scale and advance. So they were making changes to the environment without due consideration for the purpose of the testing purpose. So they found that they needed, their first obstacle they wanted to address is making that available. So they focused on that and tried to resolve that as rapidly as they could, and then they repeated that process. And this is what we talk about when we talk about experiments. So if you think about that example of the integration test team working with the infrastructure team, they had to first say, okay, this is an urgent problem. They had to convince them why it was urgent. Then they had to work together to find a mutually agreeable solution. And then they had to test that solution to make sure it would work. And then once they had a solution that worked, they had to make it stick. So that series of small steps, everyone is finding out, evaluating the environment, finding out what works. And everyone is changing behavior, and it's changing culture. So you're changing culture continuously. It's not a one-time thing where you reach your goal. So this process that I've illustrated by this example is called the Improvement Kata. And this is it's a teachable practice pattern for goal-directed continuous improvement. And goal-directed continuous improvement is really what a culture of quality is. So this is a teachable pattern for building a culture of quality. Now, I first learned about this pattern from a client. I am in the business of creating or enabling behavior change that leads to culture change. I've been working with a variety of companies since I started my consulting practice about 10 years ago to help them use and apply Agile methods. So I work with leaders at all different levels of the organization to do that. And some of my best ideas, probably all of the best things that I've learned, have come from either client problems or client ideas. So working and using this pattern, what have I observed now that I sort of look back on that 10 years? What have I learned about behavior change, besides the fact that behavior change is hard? I've learned that there's the clients that I've worked with really fall into kind of two categories. So some of them, we go in, there's always a lot of work to get alignment on the change you want to make, get the resources, find the right time, make sure that the work is prepared, that people understand what they're going to do, that they're trained, that they're ready to do, that you have coaching to support them once the change is starting. So there's that sort of choreography, and then there's the training activity. And one group of people will they'll go through all those steps, and they kind of see it as a rehearsal. And so then they're, okay, we're getting into this, we're switching to this new way of working. They switch. And then you go back, or I go back, a couple years later. In some cases, go back after 100 sprints and find that they're pretty much doing things the same way they did in rehearsal. They haven't really gone beyond that. They made the change one time, and then they just kept doing things that way. The other group of people, they do all the same choreography, the same learning, the same preparing to make the initial change, but they look at that as just the first step, right? So once they make that first step, then it takes them a while to get on their feet perhaps, but then they just keep learning. So they're looking at that process. The real change is the process of learning. It's not doing things in a new way. It's learning how to do things in a new way, and they continually keep learning how to do things in a new way. So looking back on things, what I see now kind of in hindsight and comparing what other consultants do is that a lot of us tend to look at, we measure our worth or our value and how we're helping or enable change by the energy that we get back from people in that initial part of the journey, right? We see, okay, people are excited in training, they're picking up on the enthusiasm, they're really getting into this, they're excited about doing things in a new way. And that's good because you want to have enthusiasm, you want to have energy if you're going to take an arduous step and have a lot of organizational learning. But really what you want to be looking for or enabling as a coach is that commitment to practice and continual change and continual evolution, that sort of scientific mindset of experimentation, right? So what I see now that my role as a coach is certainly to get people set up for that initial choreography to make the change and commitment to start doing things in a different way. But it's really to keep people in this safe zone where they can practice. Because when you're doing goal-directed improvement, when you're trying to create a culture of quality, the only place you can practice that is in the workplace. And so if you have to practice in the workplace, it's really important that you're choosing challenges that are appropriately difficult so you can keep learning, but also that you're keeping things within sort of guardrails so that you're able to keep making progress without causing harm to your business. You want to move forward while you're always learning, but you don't want to have, when people say they want to fail fast, you don't want to do that on the customer side of things. You want to do that in a safe way, that where you have room to recover. So then what's your role if you're on the learning side of that, if the coach is helping you stay in the safe zone, if you're somebody who's trying to focus on the process, then you're freed up to look at to learn that you're in this gray zone all the time and to sort of get used to, or maybe not comfortable, but accustomed to, adjusted to, accepting of being in this zone where you don't know what the next step is going to be. You're always saying, I wonder how we could find out what to do next, right? And so if you can get yourself in a place where you're always asking that question, and if you find yourself arguing about what the next experiment should be rather than what the ultimate problem is or what the best solution is, then that's when you kind of know that you've started to get it. So when you think about continuous improvement, which is this practice of always knowing where your destination is going to be, but not knowing how you're going to get there, that's really the kind of the essence of the scientific method. In a lot of ways, it's the essence of the creative process. An author, E.L. Doctorow, said about writing that it's like driving at night. You can only see as far as your headlights, and yet you can make the whole trip that way. So you get used to that process. And if you can get used to that process, then you can take your natural abilities as a quality assurance person, and you can take your creativity, you can use your curiosity, your open-mindedness, and your skepticism to your advantage. So I hope that what I want to leave you with is that to create a culture of quality, to be an influencer of a culture, you don't have to have any specific position in the organization. What you need to do is find a way to practice, and then you need to use those skills to interact with others, because you're not changing cultures until you're involving other people in your practice. And if you can do that practice with your diligence and perseverance, then you're going to be someone who is continually creating a culture of quality.
Oh, great. Thanks, Adam.